before David McCanles is gunned down by Hickok. He arrives at Rock Creek Station without a fear in the world. He has come for his money. He should be in a bad mood, assuming Horace Wellman has no money to give him, or at least will claim he has no money. But McCanles has just left the house of Sarah Shull, a secret that might cause greater fury from Bill Hickok than even McCanles's own wife, if the secret gets out.
"Hey, Duck Bill," McCanles called out to Hickok. "I've got a message for your boss." "Which one?" asked Hickok, ignoring the insult of the nickname that McCanles had used so frequently. Hickok had just finished feeding the horses and was about to go target practicing on the other side of the creek. "Brink or Wellman?" "There's only one man who is responsible for the operations of this station, and only one man who needs to pay up." "He's not here," Hickok lied. In fact, Horace Wellman had gone into the station as soon as Hickok noticed the Southerner approaching. Hickok could handle David McCanles. McCanles got off his horse and strutted with his fist on his hip as if he was about to inspect the buildings of the Overland Stage Company station as his own property. "It's a shame, Duck Bill," McCanles continued, stepping up to Hickok outside of the corral, "that you chose to work for a mismanaged company. If you work for me, maybe I could offer you a future. Something more than just cleaning horse dung every day." Hickok looked around him. He and Doc Brink kept the corral and station grounds clean for all stagecoaches and travelers of the Oregon Trail. He actually enjoyed talking to the pioneers, cavalrymen, and religious zealots that passed through the station onto places where life was still being defined, fought for, and carved out of the wilderness. How he dreamed of leaving this small water hole in the middle of Nebraska territory for something greater, even if it meant joining the war that had just begun. But he wasn't going to leave until he had full use of his shooting arm, until he had complete confidence in his marksmanship.
"You have nothing I want."
"I wouldn't be so sure of that, Duck Bill," said McCanles, winking with a laugh. He pulled out a handkerchief with the letters SS stitched into it and walked back to his horse. "Tell that boss of yours that I need 1/3 of my payment by next Friday. Or else." "Or else what?" "Doesn't matter to a simple stock tender," McCanles said, climbing onto his horse. "I mean assistant stock tender. Now do your job, Duck Bill. It stinks around here. I need to be off." McCanles put the handkerchief to his face and breathed in its fragrance before stuffing it into his shirt. "I have an affair to which I am desperate to attend." Hickok could have seized the North Carolinian with his good arm and beaten him senseless. But this time he let him go. He would have his chance. A man like McCanles couldn't help from sticking his neck out one too many times. The McCanles Massacre is considered one of the most controversial gunfights in the Wild West because of conflicting testimonies and the attempt to ignore the ugly facts of Wild Bill's first gunfight, if you can call it that. In the last episode, we learned that the McCanles Massacre was not viewed as a controversial gunfight at first. It was the first example of Wild Bill's bravery, strength, and heroism when confronting impossible odds. This view was the result of two famous articles written about him by national media that made him an instant star and ultimate representation of rugged individualism. In this episode, we examine the people involved in this bloody affair and their inexplicable actions. This is Dead Man's Hand, the McCanles Massacre, Episode 2, Duck Bill. Despite Hickok's legendary fame that hit a celebrity status by the time he was 30 in 1861, he was just 24 and nothing more than a stock tender. Actually, at the Rock Creek Station in Nebraska Territory, he was an assistant stock tender.
His lowly, unskilled job of tending to the horses of the small overland stage station, a mail and delivery company, was the result of needing a job he could physically handle after surviving a gruesome bear attack just weeks before. Traversing the West from Kansas to Santa Fe as a wagon driver was a brutal occupation, though he had his share of adventures, meeting up with the legendary Kit Carson in Santa Fe, visiting the younger William F. Cody when he still lived at home and before he was known as Buffalo Bill, and demonstrating his lightning-fast gun skills at saloons and towns along the way. But this was a difficult occupation. The trails west were full of obstacles that required a strong physical constitution, whether it was fixing axles and wheels and enduring bad weather and bugs or encountering hostile tribes. On one of his stage runs, Hickok encountered a bear with cubs, which, for a fearless hunter like Hickok, should have been nothing more than a brief pause in his trek. Confidently, Hickok stopped the wagon, jumped out, pulled out his pistol at close range, and fired a shot at the bear's head. The bullet, however, glanced off the cinnamon bear's skull. The bear attacked, and Hickok found himself in the fight of his life. He fired another shot, to no avail, and, with the bear suddenly on top of him, could do little but put his left arm between his face and the bear's ferocious jaws, as he used his right hand to reach for the only weapon left on his body, his Bowie knife. With the bear's weight crushing him, he slashed at the bear's throat over and over again, until it succumbed to the loss of blood and died. He pushed the 400-pound beast off of him, barely walking away with a crushed chest, shoulder, and arm. Though killing a bear with nothing but a knife was a sign of both his hunting prowess and toughness, the attack left him in rough shape. With a useless left arm, the Overland Stage Company sent Hickok to what should have been a humble and nondescript remote station in the Nebraska Territory where he could tend to horses and other light duties while he recovered from his injuries. The Rock Creek Station was relatively small for such a well-traversed stop. A shed, a horse stable, and a 20-foot cabin that served both as the station and the living quarters where Hickok himself stayed with the manager and his wife. The station was managed by a relatively low-key man by the name of Horace Wellman, and his wife, who would come to play a significant part of the soon-to-be violent story. Rock Creek Station had previously been owned by a big personality by the name of David McCanles. If looking at facts plainly, David McCanles was an upstanding citizen by every other account. He was born in Iredell County, North Carolina in 1828 of Scottish descent and from a strong military family. He ended up taking military courses while attending school and eventually wound up in the military himself, reaching the rank of commander. By the age of 23, McCanles was elected sheriff of his hometown. He was well educated and enjoyed discourse on literature and religious dogma as much as he took delight in sports, and, quote, gloried in his strength and ability as a wrestler, and challenged the strongest men at local meets. And it is a well-established tradition that he defeated all comers, end quote. These are important details to keep in mind since McCanles had the confidence and the ability to handle himself around other men, especially those who presented some real or imagined challenge to his masculinity. There are conflicting reports about McCanles' attitudes towards the issues of the South's impending secession from the Union. Some accounts say he was loyal to the Union. Others say he celebrated the South's entry into the war and its early military victories. Either way, he headed west with his family in 1859, along with his cousin James Woods, to instead chase the hope of striking it rich in the gold mining fields of Pikes Peak, like so many others in the 1850s. But it didn't take long before he crossed paths with travelers going the opposite direction, returning empty-handed from the same destination. At some point along his travel through the Nebraska Territory, McCanles had heard one too many stories of prospecting failure, and took a good look about him in the beautiful open country, and decided that he had the gumption and the vision to carve out a life in the wilderness. Enthralled by the beauty of the landscape, the creeks which provided fresh water, and the road that, with its, quote, steep and rocky banks, was one of the most difficult crossings of the Oregon Trail, end quote, McCanles did what any pioneering entrepreneur would do. He bought the Rock Creek Station, consisting of a cabin and corrals, and built a bridge across the creek and charged a toll for any travelers wanting to save a day crossing the creek themselves. This was a savvy business decision because already it was a well-visited stop. From George W. Hansen's article, cataloged in the Nebraska History magazine, quote, "On its smooth rock cliffs of Rock Creek were carved hundreds of names of soldiers who had camped here on the marches to Western fronts, to the Indian Wars, and to crush the so-called Mormon insurrection," end quote. Among the names carved into the rocks was Kit Carson, already a living legend, and a hero to many, including Hickok. McCanles began civilizing this sparsely populated and rugged region, building a cabin across the creek for his brother to live in, a nice homestead 3 miles away, and the area's first school, so that his children were not ignorant of the civilization from which they had come and of which they hoped to bring. Everything may have turned out just fine, and David McCanles would have likely gone down in history as a founding father of the settlement that would one day become known as Fairbury, Nebraska. But he ended up selling the Rock Creek Station to the Overland Stage Company. As stated before, McCanles was a shrewd businessman, the kind who wants to be paid after a deal is done. What he didn't know at the time was that he sold his property and buildings to a company on the brink of financial failure. The company only paid 1/3 of the price in cash and promised to deliver the other payments in monthly or bi-monthly installments. After purchasing the station, the Overland Stage Company hired Horace Wellman to manage things. Wellman had the unfortunate job of facilitating the financial agreement between the company and McCanles. Wellman told McCanles the same thing every week he stopped by for another payment. There wasn't any. For months, the company welched on its financial obligation, David McCanles becoming more and more irritated each time with the messenger. None of the business between McCanles and Wellman involved Hickok, who was simply trying to heal up so he could continue his adventures west. And as an assistant stock tender, one could say Hickok was at the very bottom of the totem pole for both the company and Rock Creek Station itself. Perhaps part of the mystery of what happened that day at Rock Creek Station was the fact that McCanles completely underestimated the 24-year-old, assuming his limp arm, thin build, and lowly status as an assistant stock tender indicated physical and aspirational limitations. Perhaps he mistook his quiet demeanor for timidity. Whatever the case, many of Hickok's future conflicts were diffused by his lethal reputation. But this was a few years before Wild became attached to his name, and before his lying and gambling days afforded him tailored clothes, before he had an air of authority that followed his confident gait as he patrolled the roughest cowboy towns of the West. Rather, he looked ridiculous to McCanles, or had aroused his antagonism in other ways which manifested itself in incessant teasing. According to Hansen's 1968 report, quote, "On account of some peculiarity of Hickok's nose and prominent upper lip, not then covered by a mustache, McCanles dubbed him Duck Bill, which stuck and irritated and exasperated him. This nickname was sometimes perverted to Dutch Bill," end quote. In fact, in the official court documents of Wild Bill's resulting murder trial, he is referred to as Dutch Bill. But could Hickok have been so exasperated by this teasing that he was simply waiting for an opportunity to get back at McCanles? Whatever Hickok's motives were for his critical part in the massacre, McCanles did his own part in creating a tense situation by showing up at Rock Creek Station along with 2 men as backup, his cousin James Woods and good friend James Gordon, with the goal of shaking some kind of payment out of Horace Wellman. If we are to give McCanles deserved or undeserved, depending on the historical source, benefit of the doubt and assume he had no violent intentions that evening, why did he bring backup this time? Did he think Wellman was holding out on him and needed more persuasive tactics? Did he hope a scared Wellman would work harder to get the Overland Company to pay up? An even more curious fact was that McCanles brought his son Monroe, 12 years old at the time, to the station to witness the business affair. Did David McCanles hope to teach his boy some kind of lesson about taking the law into your own hands?
On the next episode of Dead Man's Hand, the Wild Bill Project, we will give you the most accurate and balanced account of what happened that day when all hell broke loose at Rock Creek Station.